Before we progress to new material, I want to review a little bit to make sure that we're on the same page, because we're going to be moving now from the building blocks of religion to the nature and function of religion itself. The first thing we want to recall is our discussion of the progression of the supernatural world. That the earliest conception of the supernatural was probably this idea of an impersonal force that animates nature, that can be manipulated, but is more like the force in Star Wars, or this concept of mana that we learned about in the Polynesian and Melanesian tribes. From there, we use the notion of theory of mind to get from this force that animates nature to supernatural entities with minds, goals, and intentions. And just to remind you how theory of mind works, recall that I have a mind, and you have a mind, and it contains your thoughts, and it directs your actions. You have goals and intentions that reside inside your mind, and you really don't do anything without thinking about it first. And to most people, especially ancient people, the mind didn't seem to be a part of the physical body. Remember, we've stressed this several times, that ancient people didn't have any concept of the brain. When I move my hands, when I move my feet, whenever I make other kinds of motions, I have sort of sensations that I feel. But thinking doesn't cause any kind of sensation. And this led ancient people to believe in the idea of dualism, that there was something different about mind from body, and that mind couldn't be reduced to body. Also, this dualism is reinforced by the idea of dreams. When I dream, my mind is active when my body is inert. So this notion of a distinction between the mental and the physical happened probably very early on. So I know I have a mind, and I know it's known only to me, and I know that I use it to direct my actions. Now, other people act as if they have minds. They act as if they have goals and intentions. They have facial expressions, and they do things that make it seem as if they think and that they scheme just like I do. And so I assume that they have a mind like mine. Now, from there, it's a short trip to start looking at the natural world and see that the natural world seems to act in ways that suggest goal-oriented or intentional behavior. Remember, we talked about the dust devil and how ancient people would look at the dust devil, or the idea that tides roll in and out, or storms roll in and out. And this led ancient people to the conclusion that natural processes have minds. So that's how theory of mind leads to the belief in supernatural minds, minds that are not necessarily found in human bodies, minds that are embedded in natural things. Now, from this idea of disembodied minds, there are two paths to the gods, and these are what we call the animism path and the ancestor path. Remember that animism is the term that anthropologists use to describe this idea of a spiritual force that permeates nature. And in the earliest societies, early supernatural entities were part of nature. Here we see Neanderthals attempting to evict a cave bear out of the cave. And there have been all kinds of finds of cave bear bones that have been arranged in certain ways that suggest that maybe ancient people in prehistoric Europe had some sort of cult of the cave bear. They had some sort of supernatural beliefs about the cave bear. Now that's very speculative at this point, but we know that Native American mythology is basically talking animals, and so these supernatural entities were a part of nature. There was a belief that maybe storms were sentient, or that the tides represented thought. And the earliest forms of supernatural entities, there was no distinction between human and animal, or domestic and wild. I mean, people were a part of nature, the way that they lived, the lack of technology, their social organization. They really weren't far removed from their ape ancestors. And so, because they're part of nature and didn't see themselves as distinct from nature, the supernatural beings were also part of nature as well. Remember our discussion of the lion man of Hosteinstadel. This is the first known representation of a supernatural being, human form with a lion's head. This is probably the oldest known uncontested example of non-utilitarian art. It's at least 35,000 years old, and it seems to be ahead of its time. It seems to presage a development in the way that humans thought about the supernatural. Because as our ability to control the environment improves, the gods cease to become nature-like, and they become more and more human-like. They're less nature personified and more anthropomorphic, which is a word that means in the form of a human. And that happened in part because as human beings domesticated animals, they became masters of the animals. As human beings developed permanent dwellings and they weren't subject to the winds and the rains, they began to think of themselves as distinct from other aspects of nature. And when that happened, they started to think about supernatural beings that were distinct from the rest of nature. And I think human-animal hybrids are an example of this, of a transition form. I mean, the lion man is not all human, but he's not all nature either. And this is probably the prototype of an early supernatural being. This is a picture that anthropologists call the Sorcerer of Chauvet Cave, and it is on the left there you see a depiction that was drawn from the cave painting. On the right you can see some of the things on the cave painting. This painting of this supernatural being was put on the cave wall in about 13,000 BC, not long before the advent of agriculture, at the very beginnings of what we might call social complexity. And the idea, I think, is that this sorcerer, as you can see, is some sort of king. Most anthropologists will say it's some sort of king of the animals or lord of the animals that partakes of the essence of many animals. It has human parts, it has deer antlers, it has fur and things like that, and so it's some sort of conglomerate. And it's an amazing cave painting because the rest of the cave is just various forms of animals. But then there's this thing right here that has to be some sort of supernatural being. Here's a speculative reconstruction on the left of how the people in Chauvet Cave 13,000 years ago may have conceived of the sorcerer, or this lord of nature, lord of the animals. And the artistic, they drew him in the form that you see on the right, but perhaps they conceived of him in the form that you see on the left. And the reason I say him is we know the sorcerer is him because you look, you can see the genitalia of the sorcerer. But this is probably the earliest god, or the earliest thing that we could call a god, or that we could speculate was a god, and that's about 13,000 years ago. And again, it's sort of a human-animal hybrid being. And of course, many supernatural beings in mythology are human-animal hybrids. Lots of the Egyptian gods are human-animal hybrids. Anubis has a jackal's head. The Hebrew god Yahweh, who is believed to be descended from the Canaanite god El, is often seen as a bull, or depicted as a bull or a calf. And there is all kinds of imagery in the Hebrew Bible of Yahweh as a bull, or of El as a bull. And so the idea is that Yahweh may have started his life out as some sort of a bull image and then sort of morphed into a humanoid. So the idea is that you have this sort of progression from nature to this sort of hybrid to gods that are human-like. And this happened as humans began to move away from nature and became masters of nature. When you get to the Greeks, of course, you have humanoids supermen and superwomen that essentially are in charge of natural processes. Now they're no longer human nature hybrids. They're humanoids that are controlling various aspects of nature and of human society. And so we have a division of labor in the cosmos with deities in charge of functions, and this is called a pantheon. And there are many different mythologies that have pantheons. This is the pantheon of the Greeks. At this time you also see something that anthropologists have called the astralization of the gods, or the movement of the gods from the earth and into the heavens. And there are all kinds of theories about why all of a sudden the gods ended up in the sky, and we don't really know why the gods ended up in the sky. One theory is that the stars and the planets are 100% predictable. Even in ancient Mesopotamia, they could predict eclipses and moon phases and things like that. And because they're 100% predictable, it's assumed that they were 100% rational. That seems intentional. It seems designed. Someone has to be in charge of making the moon do what it does and the sun does what it does. Now, we have zero influence over what happens in the sky. So whoever's running things in the sky must be very, very powerful. So the most powerful gods end up in the sky because they run the things that we can't even, conceive of, that we can't reach. You can see the evolution of a god that lives on the earth to a god that lives in the sky in the Hebrew Bible. The earliest parts of the Hebrew Bible suggest that the god Yahweh lived on a mountain called Seir in eastern Jordan. And then in later Hebrew cosmology, he moved into the sky. The sky was a dome that was stretched over the earth, and you could get up above the dome, and that is where Yahweh lived. But he used to live on a mountain. He used to run around his territory in what's now Jordan, and then he moved up to the sky. So this idea of moving from nature through a hybrid phase to humanoids, and then finally humanoids that are in the sky, this is where Western civilization got its gods. This is where the Greeks got their gods. This is where the Romans how they got their gods. This is how the Norse got their gods. These pantheons is sort of the European Western way that gods came into our thinking. In many tribal societies and in the Orient, there was a different path to the gods. And this is what we call the ancestor path to the gods. You have ancestors, your father, your grandfather, your great-grandfather, your mother, your grandmother, your great-grandmother. And you might not remember them very well. Your parents you probably remember, maybe your grandparents not so much. But sometimes you see them in dreams. And older people talk about people that they once knew. Who are dead now, but you talk about them after they're gone, because you talk about them, they really haven't ceased to exist in the society because you still tell about their exploits. So you might hear your grandmother talk about her grandmother, or your father talk about his grandfather, or the village elder talk about some village elders that have come before, and these people are part of the fabric of society still. And one of the things that happens often is that salient incidents or stories of our tribe become things that we share around the campfire, or that we share in rituals and things like that. And one of the interesting things about stories is they morph and get embellished over time. And with each successive retelling, the stories of the ancestors make the ancestors into being more fantastic than they actually were. Right? Think about going to a funeral and listening to people talk about the dead person. I mean, all of the things that you hear are wonderful things about that person. You don't really hear any of the bad things or the faults. Now imagine that amplified generation after generation after generation, where good deeds become great deeds, where feats of strength become feats of superhuman strength, right? So maybe there was that time that Og threw a spear it landed in the cave bear's mouth, and he killed the cave bear with one hurl of his spear that pinned the cave bear by spearing him on the inside of the soft inside of his mouth. And that gets told over and over and over again. And 3 generations later, Og the Hunter killed 10 cave bears with his bare hands, and he could shoot lightning bolts from his eyes. You can see how that could happen, that these ancestors become built up to the point where they become virtual gods. You see this with the stories of the patriarchs in the book of Genesis. People like Adam and Noah and Father Abraham were amazing people, and they're the ancestors. And one of the things that was amazing about them was how long they lived. So, for instance, Adam lived to be 930 years old. And that's an amazing thing. I mean, probably whoever might have been the inspiration for the actual Adam didn't live 930 years. But in the retelling, the ancestors get to the point where they become gods. So this is a different path to gods, where it's the people that we have known, and over successive generations, over the course of centuries or maybe even millennia, these people that we talk about morph and shift from being humans that are part of our historical memory to being supernatural beings that are gods or godlike. And this is common in tribal societies worldwide, and it tends to be where Oriental civilizations get their gods.